According to a recent report by Kyodo News, in the highest-level tabletop exercise conducted by the Japanese Self-Defense Forces last year, which simulated that a contingency in Taiwan is a contingency in Japan, Japan demanded that the United States use nuclear intimidation to deter China, and this was not an isolated incident. According to sources from the Japanese government, this tabletop exercise was held in February last year and was the first drill to directly list China as an imaginary enemy. The relevant scenarios were jointly formulated by the responsible persons of Japan and the United States. During the exercise, the U.S. Navy set up temporary bases in the Nansei Island chain in Kagoshima Prefecture and Okinawa Prefecture. The scenario assumed that if something happened in Taiwan, the Japanese Self-Defense Forces would provide logistical support to the U.S. military. In this drill, Japan and the United States set a scenario where the Chinese People's Liberation Army implied the use of nuclear weapons against their coalition forces. As a result, the Japanese Self-Defense Forces repeatedly demanded that the U.S. side use nuclear intimidation in response. The United States initially refrained from taking such measures out of concern about escalating the situation, but eventually acceded to Japan's request. Since only a few Japanese media have reported on this matter, it is still unclear whether, in this simulation, nuclear weapons were intended to be used against the combat units of the People's Liberation Army or merely to launch nuclear bombs for intimidation purposes. However, in my view, either way, the nature of the matter is quite serious for China. The reason is that the demand came from Japan, a country that inflicted the greatest harm on China during World War II. Meanwhile, it was the United States that set up the scenario in which China is depicted as threatening to use nuclear weapons in the context of a Taiwan Strait conflict. This indicates that the United States has overestimated its own military capabilities that can be deployed in the East Asian region. Judging from the actual situation in recent years, the United States can only maintain the presence of at most 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the waters from East Asia to Southeast Asia at the same time. As time goes by, such a level of military strength is no longer able to determine the development of the situation. Of course, the United States has more than 2 aircraft carrier formations, but this is a more common normal situation. If the People's Liberation Army takes military action against Taiwan, it is impossible to give the United States time to send reinforcements from other theaters. Once the U.S. military gets involved in the Taiwan Strait conflict, the U.S. reinforcement forces will definitely become targets of attack by the rocket force, bomber units, and submarine units of the People's Liberation Army. As for dealing with 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in areas near China, that is, within the scope of the first and second island chains, in such scenarios, the People's Liberation Army will not need to use nuclear weapons at all, not even for the purpose of threat. This is also in line with China's commitment regarding the unrestricted use of nuclear weapons, which is different from that of the United States. Unless the U.S. alliance takes the lead in using nuclear weapons, in which case the actual situation is more likely to be that the U.S. side, finding itself unable to defeat the People's Liberation Army with conventional weapons, has to resort to nuclear weapons to win. Therefore, in my opinion, the U.S.-Japan exercises are testing the possibility of using nuclear weapons against China. Although the Japanese people are opposed to the use of nuclear weapons, after all, Japan is a country that has suffered from nuclear weapons. In fact, the attitudes of the people of the United States and Japan carry little weight in strategic decision-making. The key factor is whether the U.S. management believes it is necessary. For the United States today, whether to intervene in the Taiwan Strait conflict is a dilemma. If the United States chooses to intervene, it can at most delay the PLA's landing progress, but it will never be able to change the outcome. What's more, it will fall into an all-round confrontation with China, and in the process, the U.S. military will lose its aura of being the world's #1. Why do I say this? Because the U.S. couldn't even handle the Houthi armed forces in the Red Sea and was forced to negotiate. Secondly, the U.S. has basically never fought against opponents of comparable strength. It has only bullied weak countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, and Palestine. The only time it faced an opponent close to its strength was on the battlefield in the Korean Peninsula, where it was thoroughly defeated by China. Although China suffered heavy casualties back then, it must be noted that China was extremely weak at that time, with a per capita income of less than $10. If the U.S. now confronts the world's top industrial power, it will not only consume massive amounts of offensive and defensive ammunition, but also embolden other major powers in the world. In particular, its European allies and even Japan may rise up in resistance. Taking advantage of the U.S. being distracted, they will act like a pack of wolves to achieve their geopolitical goals through military force. After all, no one is willing to be sucked dry by a vampire. If the U.S. chooses not to intervene in the Taiwan Strait, there will be no direct conflict between the Chinese and U.S. militaries. The U.S. military can still retain its title of the world's #1, and China will certainly not take this title away from the US because an incompetent leader is a good leader, isn't that right? However, whether the US will intervene in the Taiwan Strait depends not only on the readiness of the US military, but also on the attitudes of its regional allies, which is also an important factor determining victory or defeat. The attitude of the Japanese self-defense forces can be seen from their demands in the exercise mentioned at the beginning of this article. If defeating China were easy, why would they need to resort to nuclear weapons? What is more critical, perhaps, is the overall shift of Japan's political arena to the right. In the recent Japanese House of Councilors election, the ruling coalition composed of the Liberal Democratic Party in Komeito lost its majority in the House of Councilors, while the seats held by far-right forces led by the opposition parties increased significantly. These opposition parties shout the slogan of Japanese First, oppose globalization, advocate restricting foreign investment, and show a strong revisionist stance on historical issues. For example, they call for building a country centered on the emperor, which reflects a strong conservative and xenophobic color. This is a revival of militarism. The reason why the US military is stationed in Japan is to prevent this, which is contrary to the US-Japan alliance. The United States wants to control Japan, while Japan wants to get rid of this control. If the United States goes to war with China, it goes without saying that if there is any flaw, its allies will be the first to come out to carve up the United States.